Well, we've been waiting to find out how many copies of Dragon Age The Veilguard sold, and now we have a rough idea and we'll know more pretty soon. I want to talk about that, what it may mean for BioWare in the future, for Mass Effect, or for Dragon Age, and just kind of how it's making me feel in general. So let's get into it. So we have an article from Jason Schreier on Bloomberg, and it's talking about EA says booking slid on weakness in soccer and Dragon Age games. And so I have the article here. It's talking about how Electronic Arts said bookings fell to about 2.2 billion in the third quarter that ended on December 31st. They forecasted it about 150, or I believe it's closer to 180 million dollars more than what they sold, and they're blaming this weak performance on two of the holiday games. So specifically, it calls out FIFA 25 or FC 25. We'll get back to that, and Dragon Age: The Veilguard. Now, what's frustrating is the way this was put out, and Schreier's a great journalist. I'm not blaming him. But this is just bait for the worst people on the internet. So they say that the sales, the player count or the player number for Veilguard was about 50% less than what EA expected. And it was around 1.5 million in that basically beginning of October through the end of December timeframe. That means that they were expecting about 3 million players. This doesn't really specify copies sold or players. It talks about more of it reached 1.5 million players. Like, that's kind of weird language. So I assume maybe it's counting people who paid for EA Play and were able to play it through a subscription, because it's not on Game Pass. It's not on PlayStation's option. So either way, it sounds like they expected about 3 million sales. They only got about 1.5 million. Now, that's what we know. On February 4th, there's going to be the end of quarter investor call that EA does every quarter, because they're a publicly traded company, and we'll get more info there. I think the way this is portrayed there is going to be pretty important. Let's just talk about this in context. So I really like Dragon Age The Veilguard. I think I've settled in around like a 7.5 or 8 out of 10. I would argue it has the best like final act of any BioWare game that I've ever played. I really like the characters. I like the story for the most part. I love the gameplay. I thought the gameplay was amazing. I thought it was very pretty, but it wasn't perfect, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be. I had a really great experience with it. The issues come with, the loudest issue was some of the culture stuff, some of the social, warriors, or whatever you want to call it. I call them grifters, but the people who were taking things from this game and being really annoying about it and just being awful and dramatizing things and sensationalizing and stuff. There's a character who discovers or feels like they're non-binary in the game, and they're pretty ham-fisted about it. I think it's perfectly fine to criticize that they weren't very tactful about the way they handled some like legitimately interesting issues. My personal thing is that this character Tosh, I didn't really like their non-binary journey. Like, was fine with me. I didn't bother me at all. I just thought the character was obnoxious and whiny and annoying and childish. So I didn't like the character. Had nothing to do with their situation. But that wasn't what a lot of people focused on. I still don't think the whole grifter side of this really had that big of an impact. I'll tell you from my own community and from what I've seen, I suspect the bigger issue is that BioWare, and especially Dragon Age's built-in fan base, kind of rejected this game. And it wasn't because of social issues. It wasn't because of political stuff. It was because they felt like it didn't really embrace the history of the franchise. They didn't like the way it treated the characters. They especially didn't like the way it treated Solus, who like half the players are in love with and half of them hate. And it seems like with good reason, a lot of the people who bought the 10 plus million copies or whatever of Inquisition in the games before didn't feel like this game really truly was like a sequel to any of those, or at the very least, it didn't respect those previous games. Because I believe the line I've seen multiple people tell me is that there's only like 3 choices from the previous games that have any impact here. Uh, and most of the callbacks to the previous game in games were very surface level and not very satisfying. And I heard this pretty consistently from people. So if I had to pick out one thing that I think hurt this the most, I think it was probably that. I also want to talk about how this, this game isn't alone in this issue. It's been a pretty well talked about story. Alan Wake 2, a highly anticipated game, came out in the later parts of 2023. 2023 being, like, in my opinion, one of the best years of gaming ever. And Alan Wake 2 came out to rave reviews. It has around a 90 Metacritic and OpenCritic score. I played it. I freaking loved it. It's one of the best games I've ever played. It's really, really good. It was up for a ton of awards, Game of the Year nominations, all that. And we now sit 15, 16 months after it came out, and they still haven't sold 2 million copies. So its first 3 months, it probably didn't even sell as much as Veilguard. And then we have another game that just came out last year that I personally hate, but it's fairly popular, in Dragon's Dogma 2. And I looked that up, and it's been out for close to a year. It's getting up there. And it's around 2 to 2.5 million copies. And that's a very popular game. It was up for Game of the Year nominations and other awards. And even though I particularly didn't care for it, especially by the end, it's still just another piece of evidence that, like, it kind of seems like even if games are really good and they review well and they're generally enjoyed by people, that they're just maybe not going to sell 10 million copies like they used to. The old Ubisoft formula just maybe isn't going to work anymore like it did. And then, like I said before, Dragon Age had other issues. It had issues with a tumultuous development cycle where we now know it was 2 or 3 different games that kind of became the one that turned into Veilguard. I think we can now look back and see the fairly last minute name change of the game from Dreadwolf to Veilguard was maybe some weird last minute desperation that, in hindsight, that seems more odd than it maybe seemed at the time. So I don't know how this makes me feel about the future. I actually have a video coming out tomorrow talking about a video that Mark Dara, the former BioWare dev and who was a person who was a contractor on Veilguard, he put out a really great video basically illustrating how BioWare has evolved from a studio that made a bunch of games at once to now that's going to make one at a time. And it's a good illustration on how the whole games industry has changed in the last 20, 25 years. I don't think anything that with this report changes anything I said in that video, but it does add more context, right? And I'll definitely be talking about it in this week's The Bonfire Gaming Podcast, my weekly news podcast. As for how I think this affects things moving forward, I kind of see it going one of 2 ways. I would argue, especially with those other examples of those other good games, that the 1.5 million isn't like a failure. It's not, if it was like 500,000 or something, BioWare's probably done. This, you're looking at, say it sold $70 a copy. The rough math is a little over $100 million. There's a pretty good chance there's going to be a decent tail on this game. I can almost guarantee that they're going to get a Game Pass deal and they'll get, a decent amount of money from that, I'm sure. This probably isn't the end for BioWare. What I will say is that I suspect, and I hope, this is definitely bias coming out, that we'll still see the Mass Effect game get developed and come out probably pretty fast. I suspect that this is going to put, if BioWare survives this, which I think they will, I do believe this is going to be a extremely high pressure situation for BioWare with the Mass Effect game. I'll be really curious to how that may change their plans for the Mass Effect game. It seems like they've been insinuating that this game is going to somehow combine Mass Effect Andromeda and the end of Mass Effect 3 and the Milky Way and then the Andromeda Galaxy. And, that's what the teases have suggested so far. But we may be in a situation where someone at EA may be like, actually, bring Shepard back, get some nostalgia going, do some stuff to bring in new fans. We can't have you like what I can say right now, my personal opinion is that if the next Mass Effect game is even partially a sequel to Andromeda, and that's how it's perceived when we start hearing about it, that's going to be bad. That's going to be a really bad thing. If it's perceived as a sequel to Mass Effect 3, and maybe they're careful with how they introduce things from Andromeda, that could work. But that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that this is going to turn into a situation where they're going to take some knocks here. I said for a long time, I thought Veilguard was basically, they were just trying to get it out the door to get back some of their money, because they were probably never going to recover everything they spent on it, right? That seems like the situation we're in. And BioWare can survive that, but it means that the next game, Mass Effect, is probably going to have the most pressure on it that a game has ever had for a studio, at least in the top 5, right? But I have faith in hopium that that's what's going to happen, because the alternative is that we may see them not survive this. And I don't want that. I don't even think it deserves that. The frustrating part about it, even though we've seen it happen with other studios, is Veilguard has good reviews. It was received well. The general gaming public really enjoyed it. A vocal minority, a very vocal minority of weirdos and grifters and people like that chirped a lot about it. But I still just don't think that has that big of an impact. Like I said before, I don't think the fans of Dragon Age felt like they were being respected and treated well with this game. Whether that's reasonable or not, I have no idea. This was my first Dragon Age game, essentially, and I liked it, and that's probably why. Let's wait and find out what happens. Let me know what you think in the comments of the video. Let me know, what you think is going to happen. I'm curious. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. Hit the thumbs up. That helps other people see it. If you really want more of this news about BioWare, Mass Effect, and so on, or just games in general, consider subscribing. If you really want to support what I do, consider becoming a YouTube member to get videos like this just a little bit early and to have some other perks. If you want to check out my other content or other ways to support, check out the links in the description of the video. That's all I have for this one. So until next time.